What does a weapon really preserve after the hands that forged it are gone? Not only metal, or wood, or sharpened stone. Sometimes it preserves a way of seeing the world, a way of measuring risk, of studying nature, of learning what fire will do on water, what glass can do to flesh, what light can do to fear. Across history, certain weapons appear less like tools of war and more like messages sent forward through time. They tell us that the past was never as simple as we prefer to imagine. We like to think of history as a straight road, crude beginnings, gradual progress, a steady climb from darkness into knowledge. But the road is older and stranger than that. It bends, it breaks. Entire skills flare into existence, shape the fate of empires, and then vanish as if the earth itself decided to keep their secret. In the ruins left behind, we find traces of brilliance that feel almost intimate, a formula guarded for centuries, a blade forged with impossible precision, a machine whose elegance survives long after its makers disappeared. This is not a story about superstition or fantasy. It is a story about human intelligence under pressure, about artisans, engineers, rulers, and warriors who learned to work with oil, horn, iron, sunlight, salt, wood, glue, and stone until those materials did things that still make us pause. Their achievements were not magic, yet from this distance, they can feel close to it. And maybe that is the deeper mystery. Not that ancient people made extraordinary weapons, but that knowledge itself can be so fragile. A city burns, a dynasty falls, a trade route closes, and a master dies without an apprentice ready, and suddenly something the world once knew is gone. So before we call these objects relics, we should ask a more unsettling question. How much of human mastery has been lost, not because it was impossible, but because memory failed to carry it forward? What if the first great revolution in warfare did not begin with iron, but with a line drawn in the air? Long before engines, before gunpowder, before steel factories and chemical formulas, there was the bow, bent wood, taut sinew, and a force invisible until the instant it was released. It looked simple, yet in its simplicity was a new understanding of distance, timing, and power. Imagine an open plain at dawn. Mist hangs low over the grass. A line of soldiers advances with shields and spears, expecting battle to begin at arm's length, where strength can be seen in the shoulders and heard in the breath. Then, from somewhere beyond reach, the sky begins to whisper. A second later, it hisses. Arrows fall in waves. The fight has changed before the enemy can even touch the hand that threatens them. The bow did more than wound. It transformed the geometry of conflict. It allowed a hunter, then a warrior, to act across space. It rewarded patience, training, and calculation over sheer proximity. Wood had to be chosen carefully. Horn and sinew, in some cultures, were layered together to store more force than a simple branch ever could. A good bow was not merely made. It was tuned, understood, and lived with. It carried the climate, animals, and craftsmanship of an entire region inside its curve. And with the bow came a quieter truth about civilization itself. The most influential inventions are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are elegant solutions to an old human problem: how to extend ourselves farther than the body allows. In that sense, the bow was more than a weapon. It was an early machine of imagination, proof that people had begun to think beyond the reach of muscle alone. Perhaps that is why its legacy feels so enduring. The arrow leaves the string in an instant, but the idea behind it never really disappears. Once humanity learned to strike from afar, could history ever return to the intimacy of earlier violence? What happens when a weapon becomes an extension, not just of the arm, but of the whole body in motion? Somewhere between the order of armies and the chaos of close combat, the sword emerged as something more than sharpened metal. It was balance and rhythm. It was craft refined into gesture, and in many civilizations, it became one of the clearest mirrors of how a culture understood honor, authority, and death. Picture a forge in the half-light before sunrise. The air is thick with smoke and the smell of charcoal. A blade glows orange in the hands of a smith who knows that strength alone is not enough. Heat must be judged by eye. The hammer must fall with precision. Carbon, temperature, timing, and repeated folding or tempering, all of it matters. A sword could not simply be cast and forgotten. It had to be coaxed into being, somewhere between science and devotion. That is what gave the sword its strange gravity in human history. It was practical, yes, but never only practical. In one era, it marked the warrior class. In another, it became a ceremonial object, a family inheritance, a symbol worn at the waist to announce identity before a word was spoken. Some blades were curved for cavalry, some straight for thrusting, some broad and heavy, others narrow and quick. Each shape reflected not just technique, but a world of assumptions about terrain, armor, status, and survival. And yet the sword's deeper story may lie in its intimacy. Unlike a distant arrow, it demanded nearness. It required the wielder to step into danger, to feel the breath and hesitation of another human being. In that narrow space between life and death, skill became inseparable from emotion, fear, discipline, impulse, restraint. Maybe that is why swords linger so powerfully in memory. They seem to hold both beauty and brutality at once. A blade can be exquisitely made, almost graceful, and still exist for mortal purpose. What does that reveal about us? That some of our finest craftsmanship has so often been devoted to the art of ending a life? What if the decisive weapon in history was not the sharpest blade, but a wall of wood and bronze moving as one body? In the ancient world, the spear often lacked the romance of the sword, yet it shaped battlefields for far longer and with far greater consistency. It was humble in appearance, a shaft, a point, a grip. But in disciplined hands, it became the architecture of collective force. Imagine the ground trembling beneath measured steps. Dawn light catches hundreds of spearheads at once, each one small alone, but together forming a glittering horizon. A soldier in such a formation was not merely an individual fighter, he was one piece of a living structure, protected by the shield beside him, responsible for the life behind him. The spear asked for coordination before heroics, endurance before glory. Its genius was its economy. Spears were faster to produce than fine swords, easier to teach, and devastatingly effective. They extended the body just enough to turn closeness into advantage. In a packed formation, they allowed several ranks to threaten an enemy at once, creating a layered pressure that felt less like a duel than like weather moving in. Kingdoms and city-states did not build armies around the spear because it was glamorous. They built them around it because it worked. But the spear also changed something deeper in human society. It suggested that power could be organized, multiplied, and made reliable through discipline. War was no longer only a test of exceptional warriors. It became a test of order, training, and shared purpose. The battlefield began to resemble the state itself. structured, interdependent, unforgiving of weakness in the line. There is something almost haunting in that image. A simple tool, ancient and inexpensive, helping transform violence from personal struggle into coordinated system. The spear reminds us that history does not always turn on rare genius. Sometimes, it turns on the moment people learn to move together with enough trust to become more dangerous than any one of them could ever be alone. And perhaps that question reaches beyond war. When does a tool stop belonging to the individual and begin to belong to the group? And what does that change in the human soul? Can a weapon change history, not by meeting force with force, but by turning the world itself into an ally? The sling looked almost insignificant beside swords and spears. A strip of woven fiber, a pouch, a stone shaped by river water or carved by hand, it seemed too modest to belong in the company of empire-altering inventions. And yet, in the right hands, it could strike with terrifying precision, carrying the speed of thought and the weight of the earth. Picture a shepherd on a hillside, long before he is called a soldier. His hand circles once, twice, then faster, until the cord hums in the air. The stone disappears. A heartbeat later, somewhere far below, it lands with bone-deep force. This was the quiet genius of the sling. It transformed the simplest object in the landscape into a projectile capable of breaking helmets, scattering cavalry, and altering the confidence of advancing armies. Unlike elaborate weapons that demanded expensive materials or long training in workshops, the sling belonged to ordinary life before it belonged to war. That made it powerful in a different way. It could be learned young. It could travel lightly. It allowed a person with almost nothing to become dangerous at a distance. Entire cultures became famous for mastering it, not because it was noble, but because it rewarded repetition, instinct, and intimate knowledge of motion. There is something unsettling in that idea. A stone, the most common thing in the world, made lethal through skill alone. No furnace, no forge, no polished display of wealth, just human practice refining itself until the hand could borrow the speed of a storm. In that sense, the sling reminds us that innovation is not always about new materials. Sometimes it is about seeing hidden power in what has always been there, and maybe that is why its legacy still lingers. The sling asks an enduring question about human ingenuity. How often does transformation begin not with invention, but with attention? How many world-changing tools were once dismissed because they seemed too simple to notice? What if the greatest shift in ancient warfare came from a weapon that was less about strength than about stored tension, power waiting in silence? The crossbow entered history with a different temperament from the bow. Where the bow felt fluid and almost organic, the crossbow seemed mechanical, deliberate, composed. It held its force in place, as if time itself had been tightened into wood and string, and then locked there until the moment of release. Imagine a soldier kneeling behind a low wall of earth. He does not need the lifelong conditioning of an elite archer. He braces the stock, steadies his breath, and looks down a straight line toward a distant figure in armor. With a short motion, the trigger breaks. The bolt is gone. What once required years of bodily discipline has been condensed into a design, an idea engineered into form. That was the unsettling brilliance of the crossbow. It redistributed skill. It did not make training irrelevant, but it reduced the gap between master and novice in a way earlier weapons rarely had. States took notice. Commanders did too. A weapon that could pierce armor, hold tension longer than a human arm could sustain, and be used effectively by broader ranks of soldiers was not merely a battlefield tool. It was a political instrument. It shifted the balance between expertise and organization. And with that shift came anxiety. In many cultures, weapons like this stirred moral unease precisely because they seemed to make killing too efficient, too impersonal, too accessible. The crossbow stood at the edge of a long historical pattern, inventions that weaken the old bond between individual prowess and destructive power. Once design begins to replace physical mastery, war starts to feel less like contest and more like system. There is something deeply modern in that, a mechanism amplifying human intent, making force easier to deliver across distance, changing who gets to wield power and how. The crossbow belongs to antiquity, but its logic points forward into every later age of technology. So perhaps its true significance lies beyond the battlefield. The crossbow asks a question that has never stopped following us. When a machine makes power easier to use, does it also change what power means? What if the most frightening ancient weapons were the ones that did not merely strike bodies, but unsettle the mind before impact? Siege engines changed warfare by turning patience, mathematics, and raw materials into instruments of dread. Among them, the catapult stands apart, not because it was elegant, but because it made distance feel suddenly fragile. Walls that once promised safety could now be challenged by force hurled from beyond their reach. Picture a fortified city at first light. The gates are barred. The defenders line the parapets, trusting in stone, height, and time. Then a deep wooden groan rises from the enemy camp below. Ropes tighten, arms strain. A great stone lifts, pauses, and vanishes into the sky. For a moment, there is silence, the kind that makes everyone look upward. Then the impact comes. Dust, splintering timber, a section of confidence broken open. The catapult was more than a machine for destruction. It was a conversation between engineering and fear. Its builders had to understand tension, leverage, weight, and arc. They had to measure not only what materials could endure, but what defenders could endure. A siege was never simply about breaking walls. It was about exhausting hope. Every projectile sent a message: your shelter is temporary, your boundaries negotiable, your future uncertain. That is what made siege engines historically profound. They blurred the line between architecture and vulnerability. Civilizations built stronger fortifications, and in response, attackers built better machines. Stone answered wood. Wood answered stone. With each cycle, warfare became less about sudden collision and more about sustained pressure, calculation, and the slow dismantling of human certainty. There is something chillingly familiar in that logic. The catapult reminds us that technology often evolves not just to overcome defenses, but to redefine them. A wall is only a wall until someone learns to imagine beyond it. And maybe that is the lingering lesson. The weapons that change history are not always those that kill the most. Sometimes they are the ones that teach a society that what once felt permanent can, under enough force and ingenuity, be made to fall. What if the next great leap in warfare came not from sharper steel, but from a new alliance between human intention and chemical fire? Gunpowder did not enter history all at once. It arrived almost quietly, as so many transformative discoveries do, through experimentation, curiosity, and the unstable meeting of minerals that seemed ordinary until they were combined. Then, suddenly, the old balance between muscle and force began to shift. Imagine a battlefield at dusk, where soldiers have spent generations trusting the familiar logic of distance and armor. Then a flash, breaks the dim light. A crack tears through the air, unlike any sound they have known, less like a weapon than like a storm trapped in metal. Smoke drifts low across the ground. The projectile is invisible, but its effect is undeniable. Something fundamental has changed, and everyone present knows it before they can name it. What made early firearms and powder weapons so unsettling was not only their destructive power, but their symbolism. They suggested that the future of war would belong less to the body and more to controlled reaction, to mixtures measured carefully, packed tightly, and released at the exact moment when pressure demanded escape. Fire, once feared as something wild, had been coaxed into obedience. For a time, it remained unreliable, awkward, even dangerous to its user. But history rarely depends on perfection. It depends on possibility. Gunpowder marked the beginning of a long transition. Armor that had once embodied security became heavier, then less relevant. Fortresses had to be redesigned. Training changed. Hierarchies shifted. The skilled warrior on horseback, the swordsman shaped by years of discipline, now faced a world in which chemistry could flatten inherited advantage. A new era had begun, and it was louder, less intimate, more mechanical. Perhaps that is why gunpowder still feels like more than an invention. It represents a threshold in human thought, the moment when knowledge of nature became a force multiplier on a scale earlier centuries could barely imagine. And once humanity learned to harness explosion, was there any real way to keep violence from growing beyond the limits of the hand and heart? What if the weapon that changed history most profoundly was not the cannon itself, but the idea that destruction could now travel farther, faster, and with less warning than the human body could comprehend? As gunpowder matured, artillery emerged as its most consequential expression. It was no longer simply fire in a tube. It was physics organized into power, metal shaped to direct force across vast distance and against structures once thought immovable. Picture the edge of a fortified city in the early morning. For centuries, walls had stood as the visible promise of order. They separated safety from threat, home from invasion, ruler from rival. Then artillery arrived, and the old certainty began to crack. A cannon does not climb a wall or plead with a gate. It speaks in pressure, in recoil, in stone turning to dust. Each blast redraws the relationship between people and the spaces they trust. What made artillery revolutionary was not just impact, but scale. A weapon could now alter geography, reshape military planning, and compress the timeline of collapse. Fortresses grew lower and thicker in response. Cities adapted. Armies reorganized around supply, metallurgy, and mobility. Warfare became less about individual acts of bravery and more about logistics, engineering, and endurance. The soldier still mattered, but increasingly as one component inside a larger machine of coordinated force. And yet there is something almost melancholy in this transition. The cannon enlarged to human capability while shrinking the battlefield role of intimacy and personal skill. Distance widened. Decisions moved upward into command structures. Violence became more abstract to those who initiated it, even as it became more devastating to those who received it. In that widening gap, modern war began to take shape. Perhaps that is why artillery feels like such a pivotal threshold. It did not merely improve the old world of conflict, it altered its emotional grammar. Once walls could fall from afar, once cities could be broken without direct contact, the meaning of protection itself had to change. So the question lingers beyond history. When power becomes great enough to reach us from over the horizon, what becomes of the human instinct to feel secure behind stone, distance, or design? What if the most transformative weapon in history was not designed to destroy walls or armies, but to dissolve the ancient rhythm of battle itself? The rifle changed warfare by making accuracy, range, and repetition part of a single deadly equation. It did not arrive as a sudden miracle. It emerged through refinement, grooved barrels, better ammunition, more reliable firing systems, until one truth became impossible to ignore. Distance had become personal in an entirely new way. Imagine a field once shaped by charging lines and visible courage. Men advance in formation because for generations that is how war has been understood. Bodies moving together, flags held high, commands shouted over smoke. Then rifles begin to speak across greater distances with unsettling precision. A figure can fall before ever seeing the face of the person who fired. The old choreography remains for a while, but it no longer fits the reality unfolding beneath it. That was the rifle's quiet revolution. It punished exposure. It rewarded patience, concealment, discipline. It transformed open ground into a place of calculation and fear. Strategy had to change because perception itself had changed. The battlefield was no longer just where armies met. It was a landscape of invisible lines where skill, technology, and timing could reach farther than instinct had been trained to expect. And with the rifle came a deeper shift in the human experience of combat. Earlier weapons often demanded massed movement or close encounter. The rifle asked the individual to become a precise instrument within a much larger system. It sharpened the role of the solitary decision, when to aim, when to wait, when to fire, while also feeding the machinery of industrial war. It joined craftsmanship to standardization, the marksman to the factory. There is a strange sadness in that evolution. The rifle made warfare more exact, but not more humane. It narrowed the margin between intention and consequence. In doing so, it revealed something enduring about progress. Our inventions often become more efficient long before they become wiser. So perhaps the rifle's legacy is not only that it changed how wars were fought, it changed how humans understood vulnerability itself. Once danger could arrive with such accuracy from such a distance, could conflict ever again feel bounded by the limits of sight, sound, or courage alone? What happens when invention no longer serves the warrior alone, but the machine of war itself? With the arrival of the machine gun, history crossed into a darker mechanical age, one in which the human hand still pulled the trigger, but industry supplied the rhythm. Firepower was no longer measured only by force or range. It was measured by repetition, by the capacity to sustain destruction beyond the pace of ordinary human movement. Imagine a line of soldiers advancing across open ground under a pale morning sky. Their training belongs to an older world, one that still believes courage can close distance. Then a new sound begins, rapid, metallic, almost inhuman in its consistency. Not a single shot, not even a volley, but a stream. The field changes instantly. Space itself becomes hostile. What once required many hands acting together now pours from one position with relentless efficiency. That was the terrible genius of the machine gun. It condensed the labor of many into the mechanism of one. Defenses grew deadlier. Assault became more costly. Commanders learned, often too late, that inherited tactics could not survive against industrial fire. The result was not just a new weapon, but a new psychological landscape. The battlefield became a place where movement invited annihilation, where earth had to be dug into trenches because the open world had become nearly unlivable. And in that transformation, something profound was revealed about modernity. The machine gun was not an accident of war. It was a reflection of an age increasingly organized around production, standardization, and mechanical repetition. The same logic that made factories more efficient made battlefields more lethal. Progress moved forward, but not always toward mercy. Perhaps that is why the machine gun remains so haunting in memory. It exposed the widening gap between what humans could invent and what they were emotionally prepared to endure. Technology had accelerated, but conscience had not kept pace. So the question left behind is larger than war itself. When human ingenuity learns to multiply force without multiplying wisdom, what kind of future is it really building? What if the most consequential weapons were no longer those held in the hand, but those released from far above, where human presence became smaller than the decision to strike? Air power transformed warfare by lifting violence out of the old horizontal world of borders, trenches, walls, and marching lines. With the airplane, distance changed again. So did vulnerability. For the first time, entire cities had to reckon with the sky as a direction from which history itself might arrive. Imagine an afternoon suddenly interrupted by a sound no earlier century could have understood. People look upward, shielding their eyes from the sun. What they see is not a soldier, not a cavalry charge, not even a distant cannon crew, but a machine crossing the open air with cold purpose. The threat does not come over the hill or through the gate. It descends. And with that descent, the boundaries between battlefield and home begin to blur. This was the unsettling revolution of aerial warfare. It expanded strategy beyond terrain and into atmosphere. Mountains, walls, rivers, and fortifications, features that once shaped military confidence, lost some of their protective meaning. Power became mobile in a new dimension. Nations had to think not only about armies and borders, but about altitude, speed, industry, and the terrifying logic of reach. Yet the deeper significance of air power lies in what it revealed about modern distance. The farther violence moved from the body, the easier it became to imagine it abstractly, as targets, coordinates, payloads, outcomes. Those on the ground still experienced it intimately, in shattered streets, in smoke, in silence after impact. But those directing it could stand far from the immediate human scene. This widening separation between action and suffering would shape the moral landscape of the modern world. Perhaps that is why flight feels so double-edged in human memory. It is one of our most beautiful achievements, born from wonder, mathematics, and the dream of rising beyond gravity. And yet the same mastery of air became a delivery system for fear. So the question remains suspended there, somewhere between awe and grief. When humanity finally learned to conquer the sky, did we also lose one more reason to imagine that any place below it could remain untouched? What if the final transformation in the history of weapons was not a matter of sharper design or greater force, but of scale so immense that it altered the meaning of war itself? With the atomic bomb, humanity entered a threshold unlike any before. Previous weapons had changed battlefields, cities, empires. This one changed the imagination. It made possible a form of destruction so concentrated, so immediate, that history could no longer speak about progress without also speaking about annihilation. Imagine the stillness before dawn in a city that does not yet know it is standing inside the last ordinary morning of its own existence. Streets are quiet. Water boils for breakfast. Children prepare for school. Then, in an instant beyond language, light becomes violence. Not the familiar light of sunrise, but a manufactured sun. A burst so absolute that shadow itself is burned into memory. The devastation is physical, yes, but also philosophical. A boundary has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. What made nuclear weapons historically unprecedented was not only their power, but their implication. They were born from some of the most advanced scientific thinking humanity had ever achieved. Physics, engineering, mathematics, collaborative research on a staggering scale. And yet the result was not merely a new instrument of war. It was a revelation that intelligence, detached from moral restraint, could produce consequences vast enough to threaten civilization itself. From that moment on, warfare had to be understood in a different register. Strategy became entangled with deterrence, fear, diplomacy, and the strange logic of preventing use by possessing the means to use. Humanity found itself living in the shadow of a weapon whose greatest historical effect may have been the silence it imposed. The wars not fought at full scale because the cost had become almost unthinkable. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. The atomic bomb did not just end one chapter of military history. It forced us to confront the possibility that knowledge without wisdom can outrun the human spirit. So here, near the end of this journey, one question remains brighter and heavier than all the rest. If we now possess the power to erase ourselves, what does it mean to continue calling ourselves advanced? So where does this journey leave us? After the bow's quiet arc, the sword's intimacy, the spear's discipline, the catapult's patience, the cannon's thunder, the rifle's precision, the machine gun's relentless logic, the airplane's shadow, and the unbearable light of the atomic age. It leaves us in a place both ancient and immediate, facing the same truth that echoes beneath every invention. Weapons change history, but they also reveal the values, fears, ambitions, and limits of the people who create them. Each weapon we have traced was more than an object. It was a turning point in how human beings understood distance, power, control, and vulnerability. Some emerged from necessity, some from curiosity, some from the desire to protect, others from the will to dominate. Yet none existed in isolation. Behind every blade or engine stood a mind at work, a society making choices, a culture deciding what kind of intelligence it wished to reward. That may be the most sobering lesson of all. Technology does not arrive with meaning already attached. We give it meaning through use, through law, through ritual, through restraint, or through the failure of restraint. The same species that learned to shape wood into flight, stone into precision, and atoms into unimaginable force is also the species capable of remembrance, mercy, and reflection. History is not only the story of what we built, it is the story of what we were willing to do with what we knew, and so these ancient and modern weapons remain with us, not simply as relics of violence, but as mirrors. They ask whether progress is only the expansion of capability or whether it must also include the enlargement of conscience. They ask whether memory can teach us faster than ambition can outrun us. Perhaps that is the final question carried forward through all ages of invention. When future generations look back at what we created, will they see only our power? Or will they also see that we learned, however imperfectly, how to be worthy of it?